part of BT's innovation team. You might not know that we have an innovation team, so part of my job is to go, did you know you have an innovation team at BT that might be able to help you? So that's one thing. The future of work has been an obsession of mine for many, many years. In fact, when I first joined BT, which was way back in the 90s, obviously I was only 6 at the time, I was part of one of the first, I think, formal homeworking trials that happened in the UK. So back in 1992, we ran a formal experiment in Inverness, which we very creatively called the Inverness experiment. But basically, we worked people from home for a year and tried to figure out, how it worked. To be honest, it was mostly a technology trial. Technology wasn't quite there in 1992. And I keep saying the one thing that's got us through this pandemic is what I call the holy trinity of technology. So we've got connectivity, we've got collaboration tools, and we've got cloud. None of those we had in 1992. We literally had to bulldoze people's front gardens in order to get a big enough pipe into their house to get them, things like voice and data. So cost a lot in 1992. It doesn't cost quite so much now. And homeworking, frankly, has been around for a very long time. It's just it wasn't entirely embraced until this big accelerator hit us, which of course was the pandemic. So we could have done it, we didn't do it, and that's why my job is so fascinating. So I think I always have to put this slide up. I'm contractually obliged, but as I said, I'm part of BT's innovation organisation. Those of you who know BT will probably know that I come from a mystical place called Adastral Park, which is also known as Martlesham. It's just outside Ipswich. It's our main research and innovation hub, I guess. But we have a hub that spans the globe, and partially my job is to work with our very clever researchers within BT, but also with our innovation ecosystem. Every company should have one, which spans the globe. So I do quite a lot of work with, for example, MIT over in Boston. You'll see some of the stuff they're doing. London Business School, Cambridge University, Bristol University. There's lots of very clever people I work with. And my job partially is speed dating. So speed dating those clever people with our customers. And typically my customers are mostly UK-based corporates and public sector. So I kind of speed date clever people with other clever people in our customer base. But I'm also a slightly weird part of the innovation team in that, as you would expect from BT, I am surrounded by a lot of technologists. I myself am half a technologist, and I'm never terribly sure whether it's the top half or the bottom half, but whichever half it is, the other half is a psychologist. And actually my work back in the 90s with the homeworking experiment was largely to make sure that people didn't go mad whilst working from home. They didn't, by the way, although I have to say a lot of the things that happened in our experiment happened during the pandemic. So I'm going to take you in on a bit of a journey. I call it From Automation to Zedonks, around the future world of work. This is a project we've been running, I think, for about 12 years, actually, around the future of work. And obviously, this past 2 years has been incredibly fascinating, albeit it's a slightly weird experiment because back in the 90s, we got volunteers to work from home. This hasn't been voluntary, so that's been an interesting one. And to be honest, the other interesting stuff really has been around, well, we could have done this before. In fact, Arthur C. Clarke, very fascinatingly, back in 1964, said that we can work absolutely anywhere, to be honest, within the next 50 years. He just about edged it in. So Bali, Tahiti, Ipswich, the choice is yours, potentially, as to how, where, and when we work. But again, it's taken a pandemic for us to start to even think about that. The more fascinating thing, I think, has also been around corporate strategies around this. And we're getting quite an interesting set of announcements, I think, as how are we going to work strategically into the future, given people have got a taste potentially of working from home, for better or for worse, to be honest. So not everyone has liked it. But the consensus of opinion is there's some kind of hybrid model going to be there. And I think even hybrid has got different flavours, because we've got a lot of financial services companies, to be fair, have been declaring either or everyone's back in the office, or not everyone has to be back in the office, but we quite like you in the office, but you can work from somewhere else on some days of the week. I call that an office-first hybrid. Actually, that's BT's current strategy. Then, of course, you've got the other end of the spectrum. Some companies, quite a lot of the sort of IT startup-y type companies going, offices? Who needs an office? Or you've got other companies, again, hedging their bets around, yeah, well, we might need an office at some point, but actually we're going to be remote first. So there's lots of flavours going on, but I think the common thing is some kind of hybrid. Now, the thing with hybrid, and a lot of the conversations I often start with is, what's the optimal number of days I should be in the office? Should it be 2? Should it be 3? That is the wrong question to ask. And I think hybrid is an exciting opportunity. Hybrid is an opportunity to reinvent work itself. And I use an analogy here, and my favourite hybrid in the world is the Zedonk. The Zedonk is a fascinating combination of zebra and donkey. It looks a bit like a donkey with zebra socks, to be honest. Google it. It's quite cute. But I must say it does not have an existential crisis every morning and go, am I a zebra this morning or am I a donkey? Any more than we should have an existential crisis every morning going, am I an office worker or am I a home worker? The answer is, it should be about the work you're doing, not about the location. So how do we reinvent work to actually make time and place largely irrelevant? And the thing that underpins all of this is digital, regardless of where you work. Actually, the common ground, we're not looking at a common ground being the office anymore necessarily. The common ground is digital. So how do we create digital places that enable people to work wherever? And that includes in the office. So my definition of hybrid is really similar to Linda Grattan's. What we need to do is bring in the best of everything. So the best of the physical world, the best of the digital world, and reinvent work itself so that it works for the people, for productivity, and also for the planet, frankly, if we keep sustainability in mind. So I think, we have done quite a lot of research in this area. We have asked lots of business leaders. This is actually some research we did just over a year ago with business leaders globally saying, okay, so most of you had digital workplace initiatives even before the pandemic. We were discussing how to reinvent work. The bigger question is why? What do you want to do with it? And to be honest, there are 3 major reasons as to why we need to reinvent work. One is productivity. Now, that in itself is probably a couple of hours talk, because what is productivity in a digital workplace? It isn't about how many hours I work anymore. Probably wasn't anyway. That was a factory measure. A lot of these are factory measures, clocking off, clocking on, inputs, outputs. Is that relevant for a digital world? Is that really productivity? So I think we have big questions to ask around productivity. The second one is customer experience, something I also do an awful lot of work around. But I would say, having spent quite a long time studying customer experience, you're probably not going to get a good customer experience unless you have a really good employee experience. So that's the key around employees. And then really the third one is, how do we enable people to collaborate, cooperate, communicate wherever they happen to be in a hybrid model? So that's kind of where it's what we've got to have in mind, I think, when we're reinventing the workplace. We've done a deeper dive into hybrid. Hybrid's been around for a long time. I think it's been acknowledged as not the easiest model to implement in practice. And that's why it's so fascinating from a psychological perspective, because it's a lot of the culture stuff that tends to prevent us from doing effective hybrid models. The biggest thing that we have to think about in terms of hybrid headaches, or horrible hybrids, as I also like to call it, is the meeting. We've all probably had horrible hybrid meetings, probably in the past couple of months, to be perfectly honest, as we have brought people back into the office. But the kind of meetings you have when half the people are in a physical space and half the people are not. In fact, it's usually more than half at the moment, because not everyone's in the office. That's a really complicated thing to get right, because one thing that operates very prominently in a hybrid meeting is proximity bias. The room tends to dominate, even if there are less people in the room than there are in digital spaces, because out of sight is out of mind. We have, albeit a really sophisticated brain, we also have a somewhat primitive brain, and our brains were wired tribally. And as Frankie Goes to Hollywood always said, 2 tribes can very easily go to war. So if you have an office tribe and a non-office tribe, you don't really want that to happen. I think meetings are a really interesting one, and actually there's been some great stuff being done with Stanford University around optimal meeting sizes. And I think the one thing that's coming out of the research is the smaller meetings are not a problem. It's the bigger meetings and the conferences that are the real problem. And I think, how do we create a genuine sense of presence, whether you're in a room or out of the room? How do we create a genuinely good customer experience whether you're in the room or out of the room. And again, the common ground is digital. So actually one of my customers came up with a nice motto, all room or all Zoom. Obviously, other platforms are available. Zoom just rhymes with a ton of stuff. That's the trouble. So basically, you should probably default to some kind of digital default whenever you have a hybrid meeting. Now, of course, proximity bias extends beyond the meeting space as well to how do you lead, how do you manage? Because there was some quite persuasive data done before the pandemic that if you weren't seen to be in an office, you might get bypassed for that promotion. You might not get that bonus. And again, that's a challenge for leaders that certainly, again, Linda Grattan at London Business School has been talking a lot about how do you lead by walking around when you can't walk around. So there's all sorts of things that we take for granted. I think particularly senior managers are struggling more. There was some very interesting research that was published about 2 months ago saying it's the senior leaders that are back in the office now. There's no one else there, but senior leaders are in the office sometimes 5 days a week, and they quite like everyone else back, but not everyone wants to come back. And again, the big question is why? I think the other thing about hybrid models is it's not just about place, it's also about time. We need to think, I think the time factors are less considered. So there are several things I think that we need to think about. The two tribes thing. So actually office workers work in a very different pattern to remote workers, as we've all discovered. So office workers tend to work in the traditional Dolly Parton 9 to 5. It's a block of time. When you're at home or remote, it's often, I call it time confetti. So you juggle things and you probably work longer hours actually, but it's a slightly different thing. So you need to get those cogs to mesh when you're in a hybrid model. And the other problem, certainly with offices, is that you get the Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday problem. The problem there, of course, is that you have fabulous and very expensive real estate with tumbleweed on a Monday and a Friday. And that's not desirable either. So I think the other thing is, how do we make those 2 days much more attractive for people to come in? How do we make sure that that loading is right? So there's a lot of problems we have to solve, to be perfectly honest, and very few people have got all the answers yet. So I think most of the customers I'm working with are taking a really, really interesting approach and actually admitting we don't have the answers. We're going to go in this with an experimental mindset. Not everything is going to go right, but just because it's gone wrong does not mean we should abandon it. We need to learn and figure out how to do this right. So I think that's entirely the right attitude for any hybrid model as we go into the future, because I don't know. Nobody really knows. I think we have learned a lot during the pandemic. There's some very persuasive data coming through, particularly around diversity and inclusion on the hybrid model. Now, I've been working with companies like AbilityNet, for example, and actually our disability network in BT. One of the things that's come out very strongly is that people that cannot commute for various reasons, whether they're in a wheelchair, or actually neurodiversity is a really interesting one. I was talking to someone at AbilityNet who was autistic, and they said by the time they've done the commute, they want to go home. Before they've even got into the office with the bright lights and the noise, they're much better at home. So I think that's the first thing, is we mustn't exclude people by just imposing a one-size-fits-all model. But actually, when you look at employees generally, certainly the surveys are kind of telling us at the moment, certainly a lot of surveys around the Great Resignation, whether that's a real thing or not is a debate. But I think the reasons why people often leave a company has certainly been around flexibility. Again, lessons from the data in the pandemic. Women had a much harder pandemic than men, particularly when homeschooling was happening. And the women that were not given that flexibility had no choice. They had to resign. So again, if we want to keep people, we've got to offer a more than one-size-fits-all option here. And that's where hybrid really does come in very strongly. So offices. I mean, you guys probably know more about offices than I do, but I think it's absolutely fascinating as to how offices have been changing just in the past 5 years. Again, pre-pandemic, we were visibly seeing office spaces becoming less about capacity. How many people can I get into a small space? And more about function. So obviously there were things like activity-based working and much more attractive workspaces, to be perfectly honest, that weren't all about desks and desk spaces, but were much more about the core things that tend to happen in an office. And I could think, the reasons we've missed an office isn't about the building, it's about the people. And frankly, offices are for socialising, about work mainly, might not be entirely, but for connecting, for communicating, for collaborating, for building community. You think about that function, it isn't about desk spaces, it's about how do we create environments that are compelling for people. Now, the trouble there is also one size does not fit all. Home working has worked surprisingly well for about 70% of people that were lucky enough to do it. And of course, that's only about 50% generally of the working population, because about the other 50% have had to do stuff actually on a face-to-face basis. So they've had to be physically co-located. For us knowledge workers, which I suspect includes most people in this room, we have been really lucky. And 70% of us have said, we liked it. We'd like to do more home working. We don't necessarily want to be in an office 5 days a week. But for 30%, they've really struggled. Now, they tend to skew younger. There is a reason for that. Younger people frequently are not in sumptuous houses. They are frequently in house shares. Some live with their parents. Therefore, they are competing for space and bandwidth. They also don't necessarily have hyper-developed networks either. They haven't, been in a company for as long as I have and developed people networks and support networks. So in actual fact, they seem to be the people going, yeah, I really value the office. And yet the problem then is if people who don't value the office so much aren't in the office, again, how do we get a lot of that collaboration and community coming back? So I think we've got a big debate there. I think the other debate is about our carbon footprint. There's been some quite interesting studies. We did one with London School of Economics, but there's also been some studies around just comparing full-time home working with hybrid working and office working. And actually, hybrid does not come out terribly well in terms of carbon emissions. And the reason is, of course, you're heating an office, you're heating a home, and you are commuting. So you can do some stuff about that. Obviously, carbon neutral office spaces help. Carbon neutral commuting helps. Certainly been working with a couple of companies that have also been looking at their home working strategy and saying, can we incentivize people working from home with more green energy so that we can actually reduce our carbon footprint in that way. So I think we need to think about this. And of course, the other solution to that might be less commute in terms of more hub working. And of course, we were seeing a massive growth prior to the pandemic of co-working spaces, or coffices, as I used to call them, because frankly, the only thing I need to work is coffee. And to be honest, my preferred workspace prior to the pandemic was a coffee shop somewhere. I have to say the Irish government have gone one further. I love their strategy at the moment, which is about regenerating rural areas. So they have created the POFfice, the pub-based office. Now, I'm not entirely sure I'm going to be that productive, but the message is, can you, if you don't want to work from, if you want to get out of the house, is there something you can do that's within a cycle ride or a walk away that gets people into an environment that's a little bit more social, that's a little bit more like the office, but isn't a 2-hour commute into a central urban location? In fact, the French came up with La vie de Corps, the 15-minute city, to describe this. So that's also something I think we need to watch. Of course, it's not all about people in an office either. We're just starting to do a lot more work around how do we extend this ability to offer somewhat hybrid working, certainly extend out the collaboration bubble to people that can't work from home. And that's quite interesting as well. I mean, in terms of hybrid working, a couple of the construction companies have been really quite inventive. So they can't necessarily, you can't build a house from home unless you're building your own house, of course. But you can offer flexible working hours. The idea there is, again, to try and incentivize a much more diverse workforce, try and get women into the workforce. In construction, there aren't that many. So that's one thing we've been debating. The other thing is, of course, that trendy topic of the metaverse. Oddly enough, I managed to pop up on the BBC a couple of times recently talking about what the hell is a metaverse. Now, obviously, you get into the matrix if you go into a very future vision on this, but frankly, we're not there yet. I'm not sure we want to get there, but we are looking at an awful lot of technologies now that enable us to extend that bubble of collaboration out. I'm not a big fan of virtual reality. I call it vomity reality because you generally need a bucket if you put a VR headset on me. Mind you, I do get sick on the top of a bus, so that's also probably a bit of a problem. But doing quite a lot with augmented reality at the moment. So you can see a couple of examples here. The most exciting one is the paramedic with an augmented reality headset and a haptic glove. We're using 5G to connect him using real-time, high-definition vision and touch, as well as all of the instrumentation, so that we can actually connect him with a remote clinician in a hospital who can talk him through procedures that he couldn't normally do. We've got crane inspectors in Belfast also wearing augmented reality headsets because they're climbing cranes. We can't give them handheld technology. So again, we can give them a checklist, the ability to bring in a second opinion. We're actually tethering them to drones at the moment as well. And then maybe some jobs that we think might only be able to be done physically co-located, might not in the future. Surgeons. Lots of remote surgery going on at the moment, but maybe a little bit more conventionally, hairdressing. If you saw the latest EE advert, we did actually shave someone, Tom Ellis, the actor, at the top of Snowdon, I don't know why, but with a robot arm, powered by somebody, a remote hairdresser. I'm not sure I'd be that happy about that. But and the guy in blue is actually a miner. This is not something we are doing yet, anyway. That's in China. So he's allegedly mining from home, again, using technologies like 5G. We're also not necessarily using augmented reality all the time. I think there's some really lovely stuff using mixed reality. The most exciting one is our virtual classroom. This effectively turns an entire room into a 360-degree interactive space. So no headsets required on this one. We're currently looking at, can we use this technology for meetings? And then, of course, we get into the exciting, more futuristic area, particularly exciting for me as a Star Wars fan, of holograms. Something called volumetric video, which is potentially the next stage of video. Obviously, you can do this in a number of ways. If you're an avatar, for example, you're wearing lycra and dots. In the way that we're doing it, you don't have to wear lycra unless you really want to. So we use multiple cameras to capture, again, a 360-degree holographic representation of yourself, which you can beam into all sorts of environments. So I'm very excited that at some point I might be standing in front of you going, help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. A little bit clunky at the moment, but could be the future. Then, of course, we've learned a lot about collaboration. I think the first thing is, collaboration didn't die during the pandemic. In fact, the evidence at the moment, a lot of this is Microsoft's research, is that it intensified, you might have noticed. More messages, more mail, more meetings. Death by meeting days. I keep saying I get up every morning with an impending sense of Zoom every morning. Again, other platforms are available. But I think the problem, we've all got a bit of meeting fatigue, and I think that's not a problem with virtual work or video. That is a problem with meetings. And frankly, what we've done is taken analog meetings and put them into the digital space without going, should this really be a meeting? Because we're addicted to synchrony. Could this be asynchronous? And I think one of the things we learn from the remote first organisations is they do a lot more asynchronously. In other words, written culture, rather than necessarily go, let's have a meeting, without really thinking, should this be a meeting? So I think we need to think about that. The evidence is within direct teams, collaboration has intensified. The thing that hasn't worked so well is the serendipity, the outside team, the bumping into people. Now, I get a bit annoyed when people go, well, that can only happen in an office. It can only happen at a coffee point. I found one academic paper that actually said that was true. One academic paper. And even then it wasn't the coffee point, it was the journey to the coffee point that was the big thing. I do think offices play a big part in it, but I think you can do digital serendipity as well. There are some terrifying technologies out there to try and help. There is an app called Donuts that we were looking at, which I call Tinder for the workplace. So basically what it does is it looks at your interest and matches you with somebody with similar interests. And then if you swipe right, it suggests that you go for a virtual coffee with them. Now, I am naturally an introvert, you might not guess, but that's horrible, I'm sorry. Great idea, not sure the execution is quite there, but there are some other tools that are slightly less terrifying that are helping us to do that. And then I think finally we need to think from a hybrid perspective is something that I call the death of Dolly. I love Dolly Parton, by the way. I'm a massive Dolly Parton fan. But I think, 9 to 5, I think even Dolly has admitted that 9 to 5 is an antiquated concept. And again, I think that's why we're getting a lot of debate at the moment around, is the traditional 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, actually the most productive way of working? Given that, again, it was a product of the industrial age. So we've got a lot of discussion around 4-day weeks, for example, at the moment. Very successful experiment in Iceland, which they've now adopted a 4-day week, largely in Iceland. Lots of experiments going on in the UK as well. I'm going to be very interested to see how those goes. But we know that actually longer working hours are less productive, and the problem is burnout. Burnout has been a very big problem during the pandemic because we have literally been living at work. The boundaries have gone. We've been working on this for a while, again, pre-pandemic. We've been looking at the fact that the problem of the future, as Kevin Kelly very accurately states, is not connection, it's disconnection. It's knowing when to switch off. And there are a ton of things that we need to think about in terms of techno-stress, we call it. We've been working with Cambridge University on this and Lancaster University, largely it's the Lancaster stuff that we've got up here. Looking at, how do we find this off switch? How do we find the off button? Easier said than done. So everything from, my technology actually almost forces me to over multitask. Multitasking is a terrible way of, a very unproductive way of working. So we might need on complex tasks to switch stuff off occasionally. And then with Cambridge, we've been looking at this concept of always on, this pressure, often an unwritten pressure, to be, very responsive 24 hours a day. And of course, it's not helped if you feel that if you're not seen to be in the office, you need to demonstrate that you're working really, really hard. So if your boss emails you at 2 in the morning, you feel obliged to reply. By the way, that's a very bad idea because, again, long hour cultures are a recipe for burnout. So actually with Cambridge, we did something called the Balanced Communication Diet for Business. It's a diet. We were going to call it the Cambridge diet, but someone got there first. But like any good diet, it is a 5-step plan to better collaboration behaviour. And a lot of the bad behaviours are the M&Ms, I call them: meetings, mail or messages, and managers. All of those 3 things can be controlled if you are aware that they are your stressors. So we're looking at coping strategies for that because, frankly, we need to re-establish our boundaries when we don't know when we are at work and when we are not. And actually, again, the office is a boundary too. I'm not going to dwell on AI, but AI was supposed to be the future of work. It was supposed to be the big disruptor. It was something small and a lot more microbial, to be honest. But we do know that AI is going to play a very large part in the future of work. It is not about eating jobs. It is very much around how do we blend humans and machines together. That's the focus of a lot of the research that we're doing at MIT at the moment. Again, fascinating topic for psychologists because actually people do some really great stuff. Machines do some great stuff, and there's not an awful lot of intersection, to be perfectly honest. Machines like rules and processes and data. We get bored about that. We're good at chaos and complexity and creativity. Machines are not. So actually it's augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. And I think the big thing now is how do we get people and technologies to work together better? That's going to be the big preoccupation as we go into the future of work.